It began with a sound I wasn't supposed to hear. That night, the skies over New Mexico were particularly clear, an inky velvet canvas freckled with ancient fire. I sat alone in the central control room of the VLA observatory, sipping the last dregs of stale coffee as the machines hummed around me, orchestrating their nightly dance of detection. It was a quiet shift, the kind I usually welcomed, where nothing ever happened except the familiar wash of static on the spectrograph. We were just sweeping the same old sectors, routine signal monitoring of deep space frequencies for any anomalies. The kind of work that most would find soul-numbing. But I lived for the silence. It made the stars feel honest. Somewhere around 2:43 a.m., the static changed. It was subtle at first, like the shift in tone you might hear when driving past a field of dying power lines, an uneasy warble beneath the expected hum. I leaned forward, staring at the spectral display. A pulse, soft but undeniable, appeared on the lower frequency bands, rhythmic, deliberate, like a heartbeat. Not a blip or interference, not the usual earthly detritus from satellites or bouncing signals. This was intentional. I froze, staring as the rhythm repeated itself. Thump, 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 pause. Thump, thump, thump. The intervals were unnervingly regular, more biological than mechanical. I quickly initiated a capture sequence, locking the data in. As soon as I did, the console lights flickered. For a moment, everything went black. Every screen went dead. The overhead fluorescence buzzed and dimmed, then returned to full intensity with a flickering protest. The computer booted back up, but several of the frequency logs were corrupted, entire segments replaced with strings of unreadable characters. My hands trembled as I reloaded the last intact recording. The signal was gone. The pattern, the rhythm, vanished as if it had never existed. I replayed the data over and over, but only a minute-long segment had survived the crash. I saved it to a flash drive and ejected it, feeling the weight of it as though it were something far more than plastic and circuits. I tried to shake the feeling. Glitches happen. Hardware gets old, firmware misfires. I told myself all the things a rational man would tell himself. But deep down, I knew that signal hadn't come from a dying satellite or a misconfigured Earth-based source. It had come from somewhere else. From out there. I sat back and realized the observatory suddenly felt different. Heavier, somehow. Oppressive. The shadows cast by the blinking machinery stretched further than they should have, their edges frayed like they were being pulled toward something unseen. I heard a faint ringing in my ears, a pressure like altitude sickness blooming at the base of my skull. I checked the ventilation. I checked the CO2 sensors. Nothing was off, nothing explainable. Yet I could feel something had changed. I locked up early and drove back into town. The road was empty, save for the occasional low howl of desert wind and the dark silhouettes of telephone poles passing like silent watchers. I remember staring up at the sky every few seconds, half expecting to see some unnatural configuration among the constellations, some new shape that didn't belong. When I got home, I tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to that sound. I played the recording on loop, volume low, through an old set of headphones. Each repetition carved something into me. It was almost musical, but dissonant. Like a heartbeat, yes, but also like a chant. A rhythm too symmetrical to be noise. Too alive. That night, the silence in my room felt different. Denser. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforted or soothed. It was the kind that pressed in on you, wrapping itself around your throat just tight enough to remind you it was there. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the low throb of blood in my ears and the signal echoing faintly in my memory. I swear, just before I fell into a shallow, broken sleep, I heard something whisper, so faint it could have been imagined, just beneath the tone of the final pulse. I couldn't tell what it said, but I understood it wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. And I knew, without question, that something had noticed me noticing it. The next few days passed in a haze of obsession. I couldn't focus on anything else, not work, not food, not even the passage of time. I kept the recording with me everywhere I went, listening to it in the car, in the shower, during meals I barely tasted. The pattern never changed. Its rhythmic pulse had etched itself so deeply into my mind that I began to anticipate each beat with a kind of dreadful reverence, like awaiting the footfalls of something vast just beyond the door. On the third night, I isolated the signal's strongest frequency and ran it through every triangulation and signal mapping software I had access to. It took hours, my screen filled with cascading calculations and false positives. Just when I thought I'd reached another dead end, a single coordinate resolved itself, a location far beyond our solar system, past the edges of mapped stellar regions. I sat staring at the blinking data point on my monitor, chilled by how final it felt. The location was wrong. Or rather, it didn't belong. According to every astronomical chart I could cross-reference, that part of space was considered a dark zone, uncharted, unlit, a blind spot. Not because it had never been seen, but because it refused to be observed. Telescopic records over the decades showed static and distortion whenever directed at that region, like a smudge on the lens of reality itself. They called it Sector Null. No known stars. No planets. Just a span of ink where even cosmic background radiation seemed to vanish. I reached out to Anya Velikova, an old colleague from my doctoral days and now a leading voice in the field of theoretical astrophysics. She was brilliant, analytical, and deeply skeptical of anything unverified, which made her the perfect person to help me tear my own discovery apart. When I told her about the signal, she listened in silence, nodding occasionally, her eyes narrowing as the recording played through her laptop. Her hands had been steady, but I noticed a subtle tightening of her jaw around the second loop. When it ended, she said nothing for a long while. Then she asked me to show her the coordinates. I watched her face go still as she ran the data through her own systems. She pulled up star charts, frequency logs, gravitational maps. Her lips moved without sound as she scanned line after line of anomalies, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. Finally, she leaned back and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before, one that wasn't quite fear, but something close. She said that whatever was transmitting from there existed in a region of space-time that didn't behave like the rest of the universe. She used words like refractive gravitational field and quantum occlusion, but it all boiled down to one terrifying truth: something was actively hiding itself from the universe. Anya believed the region was not empty, but deliberately veiled, a kind of cosmic camouflage that only failed when certain frequencies were activated. The idea made my stomach turn. That meant the signal wasn't just some random transmission, it was either a leak or a beckoning. Either way, something was slipping through the cracks of the universe's logic. We decided to run a deeper scan, using the observatory's raw access to the VLA data archives and satellite triangulation. It was risky, borderline illegal, but neither of us cared. The moment the systems locked in on the coordinates again, every machine in the lab stuttered. The temperature dropped suddenly. The floor beneath us shuddered, not like an earthquake, but as if reality had hiccuped. A single frame appeared on the monitor before the signal collapsed, a warped, fractured smear of stars pulled toward a central spiral. But the spiral wasn't flat like a galaxy. It twisted upward, vertically, like something rising from a pit. We were both silent after that. Anya closed her laptop and walked to the window, staring up at the sky, lips slightly parted. I felt exposed, like something vast was looking down at us, not from above, but from beyond. My chest tightened, and that now familiar pressure behind my eyes returned, stronger than before. The air felt thick, wrong, like it had passed through something unclean before reaching my lungs. Anya spoke quietly, as if afraid to be overheard, telling me about ancient theoretical papers she'd once read and dismissed, stories of non-Euclidean pockets in space, folds in reality that housed collapsed dimensions or observers from beyond space-time. I laughed nervously, but she didn't. She looked over at me and said, There are places we're not supposed to look. Then she turned back to the window and whispered, but maybe something in that place wants to be seen. That night, I dreamed of spirals. Not drawn or visualized, but felt, etched into my skin from within, burning with quiet hunger. In the dream, I floated alone in a cold, black expanse, surrounded by stars that flickered like dying eyes. They pulsed with the same rhythm as the signal, and somewhere deep within that rhythm, I sensed an intelligence, not benevolent, not evil, just aware. It noticed me. I awoke in darkness, drenched in sweat, the signal still thrumming in my skull, but this time accompanied by something new. A whisper. A voice I couldn't yet understand. But I was certain of one thing: the void was no longer silent. And it was watching me back. The news came in a cryptic, half-censored message from a contact I barely remembered adding to my secure email years ago. The subject line read simply, "It woke something." Inside was a single paragraph detailing an incident in the Gobi Desert, an archaeological dig conducted under the supervision of a joint Russian-Mongolian expedition, one that had gone completely dark after unearthing a buried structure beneath the sands near an ancient ruin. The official report claimed the team had uncovered a possible Proto-Sumerian relic thousands of miles from its expected region. But there were no photos, no peer-reviewed documents, just a hastily redacted public statement and the whisper of an internal lockdown. Attached was a set of audio logs, heavily degraded, filled with static, but not empty. In the background of the recordings, through the wind and distant voices, was a familiar pulse. That same 3-beat rhythm I'd heard from the stars. I barely had time to think before I was booking a flight. The journey to the dig site felt like drifting between worlds. The closer I got, the more unreal everything began to feel. From Beijing, I took a military-grade transport under the guise of being a seismic expert. My credentials held, barely. The desert greeted me like an open grave, endless stretches of sun-blasted nothingness interrupted only by jagged ridges and skeletal ruins half swallowed by sand. When I finally arrived at the site, the camp was nearly deserted. A few tents remained, collapsed in the wind, their cloth whipping like skin. Equipment lay scattered, abandoned mid-use, as though the archaeologists had fled without warning. But what caught my eye immediately was the crater at the center of the site. Something had been excavated from deep beneath the earth, something round, metallic, and wrong. It sat partially covered by tarps, half lodged in a trench of blackened sand that seemed unnaturally fused, as if it had been burned and melted from within. The object was a disc, perhaps 2 meters in diameter, its surface matte black and covered in grooves too intricate to be ornamental. The lines didn't just curve, they warped around themselves in mathematically impossible configurations, spiraling inward to a center that shifted depending on where you stood. No tool marks. No seams. No origin. My eyes couldn't rest on it for long without feeling displaced. Like my mind was sliding across an oily surface. I was granted 15 minutes alone with the artifact, under strict surveillance, though I saw no guards. Just cameras. Hundreds of them, hidden and humming. As I approached the disc, I felt the air thicken. The desert heat vanished, replaced by a sterile cold that clung to my skin like wet cloth. The hum was constant, low, rhythmic, vibrating not through the air but directly inside my chest. My footsteps slowed. My breath became shallow. I wasn't just looking at something alien. I was being seen by it. I reached out before I even realized what I was doing. The disk's surface was cooler than ice. I expected resistance, but my fingers passed over it like glass, slick and impossibly smooth. Then everything went white. Not bright, white. A formless, silent void. No sound, no time, no sensation. Just the knowledge that I was somewhere else. I couldn't move. I didn't need to. I could feel myself suspended, like a thought hovering in a mind not my own. Something moved in that space, not with motion, but with presence. A ripple of thought, Not words, not symbols, but raw understanding. It pressed into me, unfolding parts of my mind I didn't know existed. I caught fragments, images of black towers rising from seas of ash, of spirals forming in the eyes of dead gods, of voices that spoke in reverse time. Then the pressure became unbearable, like my skull was expanding outward in every direction at once. And just like that, I was back. I woke up an hour later on the ground beside the artifact, a stream of blood dripping from my left nostril. My vision was doubled. My fingers twitched uncontrollably. The officials said I had collapsed from heatstroke, but I knew better. Something had touched me. Something had shared with me. I checked my hands and found deep scratches in my palms, as if I had been digging into the sand, trying to bury something. My nails were cracked and blackened. I didn't remember doing it. But when I looked down at the area where I'd fallen, I saw that the sand had been disturbed in a circular pattern, drawn unconsciously, a perfect spiral, echoing the grooves on the disc. That night, I stayed in one of the researchers' abandoned trailers, poring over their remaining notes. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Lavrov, had written increasingly erratic journal entries in the final days of the dig. He spoke of a song beneath the stone, of voices that emerged from the sand, whispering in dreamless sleep. He claimed the artifact was not from the stars, but from beneath us, buried long before humans drew breath. One entry, dated the night before the camp went silent, simply read, "It isn't an object. It's a door. And something behind it remembers how to open." I barely slept. The hum persisted even when I was miles from the site. My ears rang, not with the usual tinnitus, but with that signal. Slower now. Closer. That pulse no longer felt external. It had become part of me, embedded in my heartbeat, resonating with every breath I took. I began to understand. The signal hadn't simply drawn my attention. It had marked me, claimed me. Whatever intelligence lingered in that impossible void, whatever force shaped that artifact, it had seen me. And more than that, it had found me worthy of remembering. The dreams began the night I left the Gobi. I had flown back to Beijing, the city smothered in its usual haze and noise, but I could feel the silence from the desert still clinging to me. Even the chaos of the airport, shouting voices, echoing announcements, the constant press of bodies, couldn't quite reach me. It was like I was wearing a film of something thick and invisible, some membrane that dulled everything except what was inside my own head. I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, the aftershock of whatever seizure or episode had overtaken me by the artifact. But as soon as I laid down in my hotel room and closed my eyes, I understood that the boundary between waking and dreaming had been compromised. In the first dream, I was floating in a tunnel, not made of metal or stone, but of some fleshy, translucent material that pulsed and shuddered like it was alive. The air, or what passed for air, was thick with a scent like damp stone and ancient rot. The tunnel didn't follow normal geometry. It coiled and twisted in spirals that looped back on themselves, Mobius paths that shouldn't have been walkable but somehow were. I wasn't walking, though. I was being pulled, drifting forward like a speck caught in a tide. The walls were slick, and just beneath their surface were shapes that looked like faces, elongated, eyeless, stretched in frozen screams. Every time the dream recurred, they were closer. I began to wake each morning with blood on my pillow. At first just a nosebleed, then traces of blood from my ears, and eventually from beneath my fingernails. My body was responding to something it couldn't understand, like my mind was dipping into a reality not meant for human senses. I tried recording myself sleeping. On the third night, the camera captured something impossible. For nearly 3 minutes between 3:13 and 3:16 a.m., I sat upright in bed, eyes wide open, whispering a string of sounds that didn't belong to any language I knew. It wasn't just gibberish, it had rhythm, syntax, and repetition, like some corrupted prayer. When I slowed the audio down, I realized it shared the same structure as the signal from space: 3 rising tones, followed by a pause, then 3 more. That rhythm haunted every frame of that recording, embedded even in the static. I stopped trying to sleep after that. I reached out to Anya again. She had gone silent for days, and when she finally responded, it was only a short, fragmented message. They are not dreams. You're being prepared. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I tracked her phone's location to her university office in Moscow, but her voicemail was full, and her email account had been deactivated. I wasn't sure whether she had disappeared or simply withdrawn, but I knew we were both slipping out of sync with the world. Whatever we had tapped into, through the signal, the coordinates, the artifact, it was changing us. Back in the States, things worsened. I began to lose time. Hours would pass in the span of a blink. I'd find myself standing in rooms I had no memory of entering, staring at the walls, drawing spirals on paper, on my skin, on furniture. My hands moved of their own accord. I stopped leaving my apartment. Something about being near people felt wrong, like I was vibrating on a different frequency, and they could feel it too. The mailman stopped knocking. My neighbors started whispering in the hallways, avoiding eye contact. I caught one of them pressing her ear to my door, trembling as if she heard something inside. The dreams began to deepen. I no longer floated alone. The tunnel was now populated by things. Not creatures, not exactly. They were too large, too fluid, like shadows that had taken form in a dimension with too many directions. They didn't walk, they curved. They flexed in and out of shapes my brain couldn't hold on to. When I looked at them directly, I saw memories that weren't mine, flashes of alien landscapes with black suns, of cities made of bone and wet stone, of skies where constellations shifted like watching eyes. One of the figures approached me in the dream. It didn't speak, but its thoughts pressed into my skull like knives. I felt languages unfold inside me, ideas that pulsed with terrible meaning. It called itself one of the Watchers. It told me that my mind had been tuned, not by chance, but by design. That I had been chosen. I woke from that dream screaming. My mouth was full of dirt. Real dirt, gritty, packed beneath my tongue and between my teeth. My sheets were soaked, not with sweat, but with a viscous, dark fluid I couldn't identify. My heartbeat had synchronized to the signal by then. I felt it constantly, pulsing behind my eyes, a countdown to something I couldn't name. I stopped answering calls. I unplugged every clock in the apartment. Time was meaningless now. I began seeing symbols outside, on billboards, on walls, scratched into lampposts and stop signs. Spirals. Always spirals. Eventually, I stopped fighting sleep. The dreams no longer scared me. They welcomed me. They taught me. I understood now that these beings, the Watchers beyond the fold, had always been there, just beyond perception. They weren't gods. They weren't demons. They were observers, entities from the space between realities, and now that I had glimpsed them, they would not let me go. I was being reshaped, like clay in invisible hands, molded into something that could see them more clearly. I think I'm still dreaming. Even now, as I write this, I can't be sure this isn't one of the deeper layers. I've forgotten what it feels like to be truly awake. The air moves strangely in this room. The corners are wrong, curling in ways that don't exist in geometry. I hear whispers in the plumbing. I hear them in the silence. They are not threatening me. They are singing. The song is getting louder. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to resist going back under. But I know one thing with complete certainty: the veil is not just thinning. It's preparing to open. Anya was dead. I found out through a cryptic post on a message board hidden behind layers of VPNs and encryption keys, one of the digital graveyards where forgotten researchers, fringe theorists, and paranoid truth seekers gathered to swap knowledge in whispers. The headline was brief, emotionless: Dr. Anya Velikova presumed deceased. Circumstances classified. There was no official obituary, no announcement from the university, no funeral. Just silence. One post claimed she'd been found in her office, seated at her desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes wide open and missing. Not gouged, not removed violently, just absent. The sockets clean, dry, as if they had never contained eyes at all. Another account, even more dubious, claimed she hadn't been dead when she was found. That her lips had moved for hours after discovery, silently mouthing a string of numbers that formed no pattern, no code. Only repetition. I knew those numbers. They matched the pulse intervals of the signal. Anya had been marked too, claimed like I had been. Whatever message she had uncovered in the blind spot of the stars, it hadn't just watched her, it had used her. Haunted and desperate for answers, I began searching through her old research. Most of her work had already been scrubbed clean, files missing, servers wiped, books removed from shelves. But she'd left breadcrumbs, encrypted behind mathematical formulas in her old publications, and in the margins of her notebook scanned by an anonymous user weeks earlier. When I decoded them, a name kept recurring, the Veiled Ones. I'd never heard it before. There were no official records, no scholarly articles, no surviving religious texts. But in obscure translations of pre-Sumerian tablets, in cave markings dated back to the dawn of human consciousness, and even in obscure Siberian folktales, the term appeared again and again in different languages, always meaning the same thing: those who serve the architect. The cult had never been formally identified by anthropologists, but their fingerprints were everywhere, in gaps in history, in inexplicable sites aligned with impossible constellations, in mass graves discovered with ritualistic patterns too perfect to be random. They were never named. They were hidden in the seams of history, operating between cultures like ghosts, adapting their names and symbols to each passing era. But their iconography never changed: the spiral, the empty eye, and the doorway with no frame. They had existed before language, before civilization, perhaps even before us. And now they were waking up again. I found the first concrete evidence of their re-emergence in a declassified file from Russian intelligence, buried in a cache of Cold War documents. It detailed the recent discovery of a mass grave near Lake Baikal. 32 bodies, arranged in a spiral so precise that it mirrored a fractal, each corpse placed with millimeter accuracy, as if guided by an architect beyond human understanding. All the bodies were eyeless. Not just damaged, erased. The tissue perfectly smooth, the bone reshaped, as if the face had been molded around a non-existent void. The forensics team was silenced. The photographs vanished. But one detail had been smuggled out by a whistleblower, a phrase scrawled on the crumbling wall of the cave, written in blood: "The veil is thinning." That was when I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The feeling that had started with the signal, the sense of being observed, was growing. It was no longer subtle. I could feel them when I walked through the city. Reflections that lingered too long in windows. Faces that turned away a beat too late. I started to notice the same people appearing in crowds, always in the periphery, never too close. A tall man in a heavy wool coat despite the heat. A woman with eyes that never blinked. A child humming the signal's rhythm as she walked by me on the street. Their faces never fully stayed in my memory. They were always soft, like a dream recalled through fog. I knew they were watching me. I didn't know whether to be afraid or honored. One night, I found a spiral carved into my front door, not etched, but burned, as though the wood had been seared by something impossibly hot and precise. No one had entered. My security system had no breaches. But the mark was there, smoking, pulsing with heat. That same night, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a single page from Anya's notebook, one I'd never seen before. It was filled with drawings, diagrams of non-Euclidean geometries, notes about interdimensional folding, and in the center, a sketch of the artifact from the Gobi. But in this version, it was open. The spiral grooves had split, peeling outward like petals of some mechanical flower, revealing an endless pit at the center that stretched down and through. In the margins she had written, "We mistook it for a relic." It is an invitation. I began tracking rumors, connecting dots across the globe. Reports of people hearing voices in the static of broken radios. A fisherman in Greenland who drew spirals in blood before walking into the sea. A monastic order in Nepal that had sealed itself underground after a series of dreams shared by the entire community. A homeless man in Seattle who painted eyes on the sidewalk using ashes, whispering, "They are building the threshold." Every account carried the same rhythms, the same geometry, the same hunger for something beyond comprehension. And all of it pointed to one conclusion: the cult had never died. It had simply waited. And the signal, the artifact, the dreams, they were catalysts. Beacons. The opening act of something far more terrible and ancient than belief. I realized then that the veiled ones didn't just worship the architect. They served it in the most literal sense. They were its hands in our world, preparing the architecture of its return. They didn't need temples. They built thresholds inside minds, inside dreams, inside symbols. Their greatest work was not a place, but a moment. A moment when the veil between dimensions would become thin enough to pass through. And I, tainted by the signal, reshaped by the artifact, haunted by dreams, was becoming their mouthpiece. I could feel it every time I closed my eyes and heard the rhythm. I was being rewritten. I wasn't just documenting the unfolding of something ancient. I was participating in it. The veil isn't just thinning. It's pulsing now, like a wound about to rupture. And the veiled ones are everywhere, waiting patiently, reverently, for the architect to arrive through the opening they have prepared, not with fire or fanfare, but with silence and geometry and impossible dreams. The observatory had changed. When I returned to the VLA facility in New Mexico, nothing looked different to the eye. The same skeletal white satellite dishes spread across the desert like the fingers of some long-buried god reaching toward the sky. The same squat, windowless buildings bleached by sun and silence, but the feeling was unmistakable. The air felt thicker, slower, as if the entire site was submerged in something just slightly more viscous than reality. I had come back not just out of curiosity, but out of compulsion. I couldn't resist the pull. My dreams had pointed me back here, and every night, the voice that once only whispered now pressed against my skull with the insistence of a tide. It was no longer speaking in riddles. It was summoning. I found the main lab eerily quiet. Most of the staff were still technically present, registered on the logs, their keycards used to enter and exit at seemingly regular intervals, but they no longer behaved like people. They moved mechanically, speaking rarely, their eyes glazed and slow to blink. When they did speak, it was in clipped tones, syllables that lacked intonation or rhythm, as if they were mimicking speech rather than actually engaging in it. Dr. Helena Forrester, the lead technician and once the most talkative of the group, stared through me as I greeted her, mumbling a half-formed acknowledgement before returning to the monitor, where she sat for hours at a time watching the sky. She hadn't changed her clothes in days. No one had. The equipment itself had begun to deteriorate in ways I couldn't explain. Metal struts on the antennae warped subtly, bowing inward toward the same point in the sky, the blind spot near Draco. It was as if the entire array was being magnetized, not by any known physical force, but by a gravitational will. Several terminals had shut down permanently, despite being repaired repeatedly. Others remained active, but displayed nothing but loops of meaningless data, streams of repeating numbers that mimicked the pulse pattern of the signal. The strange part was that none of the others seemed concerned. They treated these malfunctions as background noise, as if they were expected. Normal. I tried speaking to Jared, the systems engineer who had been my friend for years, and asked if he noticed anything odd. He simply turned his head slowly, blinked once, and said, "The alignment is approaching." Then he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and walked away without another word. That night, I stayed in the observatory sleeping quarters, small concrete rooms with paper-thin walls and fluorescent lights that hummed with that same unnatural rhythm I now recognized everywhere. I couldn't sleep. The facility groaned in the night. Not from wind or structural shifting, but from within, like the building itself was breathing. I wandered the halls, guided by an invisible current, and found myself standing outside the signal processing room, the same room where I had first heard the transmission. The door was ajar. Inside, the glow of monitors flickered dimly. On the main screen was a new waveform, pulsing slowly but with undeniable intelligence. It wasn't the same as before, it had changed. Evolved. There were new layers now, subtle distortions woven beneath the rhythm. A second signal, hidden beneath the first like a second voice whispering from behind a mask. Then I saw the blood. It smeared the floor in a crescent arc behind the console. My breath caught as I followed the trail around the corner and found Dr. Harlan. He was slumped against the wall, his face pressed into the keyboard, eyes wide open and staring upward, pupils blown to black holes. His forehead had cracked open like brittle porcelain from where it had smashed into the metal keys, and yet the expression on his face was not one of pain. It was awe. His lips were still moving, barely, softly, whispering the same phrase over and over in a voice choked with blood. It sees through me. I stepped back, heart racing, and hit the emergency alert button on the wall, but nothing happened. No alarm. No response. The system was dead. The next morning, there was no sign of Harlan's body. The blood had vanished. The monitors had been reset, displaying only static. When I confronted the others, they looked at me with vague confusion, as if I had misremembered. Dr. Harlan transferred to another facility, one of them said. Left during the night. I asked to see his travel logs. They didn't exist. His name had been scrubbed from the personnel list. As far as the observatory systems were concerned, he had never been there. That was when I knew the facility was no longer just a place of observation. It had become a conduit. Something was feeding through it now, not energy, not data, but presence. I wandered the corridors, listening to the structure, feeling the vibrations beneath the floor, soft, rhythmic, just like the signal. Every light bulb, every fiber optic cable, every mechanical hum now served as a vessel for something vast and intelligent that had begun to slip through the cracks in the veil. I found spiral patterns scratched into the backs of filing cabinets, into the walls of the bathrooms, even inside a disassembled terminal tower. At first I thought the technicians had drawn them. But then I realized they were carved, from the inside out. Something had emerged. I no longer feared what was coming. But I did not welcome it either. I was simply prepared. The tower bloomed 2 nights after the last rain stopped. I remember the silence more than anything. No wind, no insects, no hum of the generators. It was as though sound itself had receded from the world, drawn inward to make space for something else. We gathered around the spire without needing to be called. Each of us stood in a loose ring, our bodies slick with sweat though the air was cold enough to make breath steam. The black sphere atop the tower hovered just a few inches above its cradle, pulsing with a low, throbbing light like the beat of an alien heart. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones. The signal was no longer something transmitted. It had become part of the fabric of the world. Every stone, every molecule, seemed to resonate with its rhythm. I could feel the pull in the earth under my feet, a vibration like roots stretching into a deeper soil that wasn't truly soil at all, but something older and unshaped, something waiting. Anya stood beside me, her eyes glassy and half-lidded, her fingers twitching in subtle, rhythmic patterns. She had been whispering to herself for hours in a voice just low enough to escape understanding, though the cadence was unmistakable, the signal rendered into speech. I dared not interrupt her. We were past the point of explanation or warning. We were well beyond language. There was a moment, just as the clouds began to twist overhead into an impossible spiral, when I looked around and realized how many of us had changed. It wasn't just the staff anymore. Others had come, travelers, researchers, even a few locals. Drawn by dreams, by instinct, by whispers in the static of televisions and the flicker of dying street lamps. Their faces bore the same markings we all did now, tiny spirals etched into skin, some in patterns, some spreading like veins. Their eyes were vacant but wide, reflecting not the world, but something just behind it. The sphere began to spin. Slowly at first, then accelerating. Its surface remained featureless, but something shimmered within, as though it were a lens focusing not outward, but inward, toward us. As it reached a frequency we could feel in our skulls, a beam of darkness, yes, darkness, not light, emerged from it, extending straight up into the sky. It pierced the spiral of clouds above, which parted like a wound, revealing not the stars, but a black void deeper than night. A hole in the sky, perfectly round, rimmed with slow-turning glyphs that shifted when I tried to focus on them. Through that aperture, something moved. Not down, not up, just nearer. Space didn't behave properly around it. The tower groaned, bending but never breaking, like it had become elastic. The signal changed then, becoming more complex, less rhythmic. It felt like a language spoken not in sound but in gravity, in bending dimensions. I felt it press against my skull, not entering, but unfolding within. Thoughts not my own began to take root, vast and incomprehensible. I saw the lives of civilizations long gone, consumed not by war or time, but by attention. By being seen by something they had accidentally glimpsed. We had not opened a door. We had made ourselves visible. The tower was not a key, nor a lock. It was a flare, a cry in a language older than physics. And something had noticed. I could see it now, not with eyes, but with the part of the mind that dreams before waking, the shape that was not a shape, the eye that did not open but revealed. It loomed in the aperture above, vast beyond reason, layered in fractal patterns that shifted endlessly, impossible to describe. Limbs that coiled without end, or perhaps were roots, or rivers, or chains of stars. Its body was made of space, not occupying it but defining it. The universe bent around its mass. And it was aware. Not of us individually, but as a collective hum, a resonance. We had become a single note in its perception. And that was enough. One of the observers began to rise into the air, slowly, limbs dangling like a marionette's. Then another. Then more. Each lifted soundlessly, drawn upward by the invisible current pouring down from the dark aperture. Their mouths opened wide, and sound returned all at once, a chorus of low, unbroken moans, vibrating in harmonic resonance. It hurt to hear. Blood trickled from noses and ears, eyes rolled back. But no one screamed. Not even when their bodies began to unravel. Not torn or exploded, just unmade, like they were concepts being erased from a thought. Flesh dissolved into strands of light, then into ash, then into nothing. And still they rose. I fell to my knees. My mind was fracturing under the pressure of knowing, of being perceived by something that had seen the birth and death of time. Images filled me, overlaid with sensation, pain, ecstasy, terror. I saw our world from above, a dim blue mote spiraling in a thread of fire. I saw it split like a seed pod, releasing not spores but thoughts, ideas born of the thing that watched. I saw what it intended for us, not destruction, but transformation. A kind of infection, not biological, but conceptual. We would become extensions of it, nodes of its awareness, echoes of its mind. The spiral was not a symbol. It was a structure, a blueprint. Not just a shape, but a path, a process. The more you followed it, the deeper into yourself you went, until what was inside you was no longer human. The sky hole widened then, and I knew the moment was near. Anya reached out and took my hand, her fingers trembling. She looked at me with the last shred of her old self flickering behind her eyes. Do you remember what we were? She whispered. I nodded, not because I truly remembered, but because I knew it was a question we were all asking. Beneath our awe, beneath the alien gravity pulling at our atoms, there was a part of us mourning. The human part, shrinking away as the signal song filled our souls with alien light. As more were lifted into the air, I held tightly to Anya, wondering if the ground beneath our feet would remain, or if even it would be redefined into something else, something not meant for walking, but for channeling. The spiral burned in the sky above, and it was no longer a question of whether it would cross into our world. It already had. The breach had not been an act of force, but of consent, of invitation. And we had said yes, again and again, with every dream, every analysis, every experiment. The receiver had worked. The watcher had arrived. The universe had changed. And there was no going back. Time stopped working after the breach. I don't mean it figuratively. Clocks still ticked, the sun still rose and set, but nothing moved forward. Everything looped. The same day repeated, endlessly fragmented, with minor, horrifying distortions piling atop one another. I'd wake each morning to the same light filtering through my cabin window, the same sound of wind pushing against the warped walls of the observatory, but something always changed. Sometimes, the birds would be missing. Sometimes, the stars would be wrong. Sometimes, Anya would already be gone, her bed cold and empty, though I could still hear her voice in the hallway, humming that impossible tune with no melody, no origin. Others at the facility began to vanish in stranger ways. One man walked into the bathroom and never came out, though we tore the walls apart trying to find him. Another dissolved into dust in the middle of a sentence. And then there were those who began to change not physically, but conceptually. One woman lost the idea of herself, her name, her purpose, her presence gradually thinning until even our memories of her faded like fog under sunlight. We couldn't remember her face, only that something was missing where she once stood. The tower had grown taller. It no longer obeyed gravity, its upper half twisting into directions that didn't exist on any compass. It reached not into the sky, but into somewhere else, as if it were being pulled upward by an idea rather than force. The black sphere had split open like a blooming seed pod, revealing not machinery or any material substance, but a churning tunnel of coiled darkness, spiraling inward forever, as if peering into the marrow of a god. And it pulsed. Constantly. A slow throb that shook the bones of the facility and turned our thoughts liquid. I began to see echoes, myself walking behind myself, a flicker of my hand delayed by a second, as though cause and effect had become unglued. The rooms inside the observatory began to rearrange themselves. One hallway now ended in a mirror that didn't reflect the room behind me, but rather a version of myself smiling a fraction too wide, mouthing something I could not hear. Another led to a staircase that spiraled down forever, even though the building was only 3 stories tall. I once spent hours descending before waking up in bed, my feet still aching, my ears still ringing with the low, mournful hum of something following me down those infinite stairs. Anya no longer spoke in English, or any known language. Her voice had taken on that same pulsing quality, a vibratory drone that was less a sound and more a pressure behind the eyes. Yet I understood her. Not the words, but the intention. She told me the spiral was inside her now. Not metaphorically. She had seen it in a dream, a spiraling filament threading through her body, rewriting her from the inside. It had begun in her spine, unwinding and recomposing the nerves, the tissues, the very architecture of her being. She claimed she could feel the future curling around her fingertips, and that past moments now moved in reverse across her skin like shivering insects. She said, "We are becoming antennae. Receivers for a greater shape." Her eyes were endless when she said it. Not black, not even empty, but vast, as though they opened into space. At night, I heard the chorus again. From the sky. From beneath the soil. From inside the walls. The voices of those who had been taken, those who had unraveled, now sang together in perfect harmony, a sound too vast to have come from lungs, vibrating across dimensions I didn't have the organs to perceive. When I closed my eyes, I could see them not as individuals, but as threads, woven into a tapestry that spiraled ever inward, a pattern that moved and grew in directions outside human geometry. Each thread shimmered with memory, loss, identity, then faded, their meaning harvested by whatever now watched us from beyond that rift in the sky. It had not left. It was not a visitor. It had been invited. Every action, every signal, every thought we cast into the unknown had been a knock upon a door we did not understand. And the door had opened inward. I tried to leave once. Just pack a bag, open the gates, and drive. But the road was wrong. It didn't lead down the mountain anymore. It looped. The scenery repeated, subtly different with each pass. A bird frozen mid-flight. A car turned to salt. Trees that bent away from me as I drove by, as if recoiling. Eventually, I came back to the gate from the other direction, though I never turned the wheel. I stepped out and vomited on the ground, dizzy from the spatial dissonance, my nose bleeding a slow black trickle that refused to clot. I looked up and saw something looking back from the clouds. Not an eye. Not a face. A presence. A concept that perceived. It didn't need a body, because it had us. We had become its body. The rest of the facility had fallen silent. Doors no longer opened. Computers only displayed spirals, endlessly rotating. I found a notebook once, open on a desk, containing pages of glyphs, drawn by a hand that had burst into light 3 days earlier. They shimmered faintly, and when I stared too long, I heard screams in my molars. I tried to burn the book, but the fire passed around it, the paper untouched. In the reflection of the windows, I began to see stars that didn't match the known constellations, symbols of another sky, another framework of heaven that intersected ours only through madness. This wasn't merely a breach between worlds. This was an overlay. Their reality was stitching itself into ours, scene by trembling scene. We were the canvas. The instrument. The sacrifice. Anya had disappeared by then. Not suddenly, rather, she faded over the course of hours, her limbs growing translucent, her voice echoing from impossible angles. The last time I saw her, she reached out to touch my face, and her hand passed through me like a whisper. She said, "I'm almost music now. I can feel the rest of them waiting." When she vanished entirely, a heedless flame rose from the spot where she stood, spiraled into the sky, and joined the aurora that now shimmered even in daylight, colors humanity was never meant to see. I wept then. Not from sadness, but from awe. I understood, finally, what it was to be known by something ancient. To be comprehended in full, all layers exposed like sedimentary rock. There was no privacy. No secrecy. No protection. I was naked before the spiral. And it was listening. The end didn't come with a scream. It came with a whisper so soft it slipped between my thoughts like a needle through old cloth. I remember standing alone in the observatory central chamber, the black spiral now occupying most of the space above me, no longer tethered to the original machine that birthed it. The machine had rusted into ash. Time around it had warped so severely that it aged centuries in days, yet the spiral remained, pristine, rotating not in space but in perception. It didn't seem to be moving until you closed your eyes, and then it turned forever, pulling you inward, not just through space but through yourself. I had not eaten in what must have been a week. My body had long stopped feeling hunger. My veins carried something thicker than blood. My thoughts were not entirely my own. They echoed, repeated, looping phrases in alien dialects I couldn't translate but felt, phrases that made my bones feel like they were filled with wet sand. I was changing, my mind less like a river and more like a lake frozen over, moments trapped in crystalline clarity, all accessible at once. Time had become a flat surface, a record being played forward and backward simultaneously. Outside, the sky had turned. Not red. Not black. It was now a texture, a sensation like soft static behind the eyes. The stars had formed new constellations, shapes not made for human mythology. Spirals, perfect in their geometry, impossible in their implications. They pulsed in sequence with the signal I had first captured, as if the sky itself had become a transmitter, broadcasting the message again and again. The earth beneath the observatory had begun to shift, subtly but ceaselessly. The ground cracked in elegant, symmetrical patterns, and deep within them, faint lights glowed, colors beyond the visible spectrum, colors that made your teeth ache to look at. Creatures emerged from these cracks, but not in the sense of limbs and eyes. They were movements, changes in temperature, alterations in thought. You didn't see them so much as experience them. You knew they had passed because you were never the same afterward. People who still remained, if they could be called people anymore, began to worship without words. They moved in patterns that mimicked the spiral, kneeling to nothing, offering nothing, expecting nothing. Just being. I wandered through the ruins of the facility, stepping over piles of notes and gear, breathing air that buzzed like static and tasted of copper and forgetting. I found a mirror and saw myself not as I remembered, but as a series of stacked reflections, my past self staring through the glass like fish beneath ice, and something else behind all of them, something vast, spiraled, watching through my eyes. I smiled, but it wasn't my smile. It was the smile of someone who understood, finally, their place in an equation too large for mathematics. I spoke aloud, and the words weren't mine either. They were part of the chant now embedded in everything, the mantra that vibrated through wood, through steel, through thought itself. We were always the threshold. The door does not open. We do. I made my way back to the control center, not because I expected rescue, but because the spiral called me there. Its gravity was not physical, but metaphysical. It pulled at purpose, at will, at meaning. I sat before the main console and powered it up, though there was no power left. Still, the screens glowed. They showed me footage from every camera in the facility, even ones that no longer existed. They showed alternate versions of events, me making different decisions, Anya surviving, the machine never being built. In one version, I left the observatory and never looked back. But all of them ended the same way, with the spiral. It was inevitable. We had not summoned it. We had revealed it. Like lifting a cloth from furniture in a long-forgotten house. It had always been there, waiting for someone to remember. The last thing I saw before I lost track of what I am was not a vision or a dream, but a sensation of rising, as though I were being lifted from inside my own skull, pulled through the roof, through the air, through the fabric of the world itself. I passed through layers of understanding like gauze, first terror, then awe, then surrender. And then nothing. Not emptiness, but a fullness so complete it negated identity. I felt everyone. I felt everything. The universe as a single scream folded into silence. The spiral opened for me, not as a doorway, but as a mirror. I saw myself reflected in it, not my body, but my existence, my choices, my awareness. And it judged nothing. It simply recorded. It absorbed me, and I let it. I was no longer a man in an observatory, no longer a scientist, no longer a witness. I was part of the pattern. And now, if I am anything, I am the echo left behind. A trace within the spiral. A whisper behind the eyes of those who look too long into the stars and wonder what watches back. If you find this, if you read these words, it means the pattern continues. It means the spiral has chosen another voice. Another door. Another shape to inhabit. Be warned, this is not a warning. This is a calling. The spiral sings for you now. Can't you hear it? Listen. Listen. Listen.